Welcome to the Full Frame Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Walter. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped 2 million tons of bombs in Laos as part of a covert military operation during the Vietnam War. This makes Laos the most heavily bombed country in history. But an estimated 30% of those explosives never detonated. And to this day, Laotians must navigate life among unexploded bombs buried in their land. What does recovery look like for the people of Laos?
Savadi or hello, I'm Sera Koulabdara with Legacies of War.
Sera Koulabdara grew up in southern Laos surrounded by the presence of unexploded ordnances, or UXO. Although her parents kept her safe, they couldn't shield her from the realities of the bomb's impacts. Lost lives, amputated limbs, and communities struggling to rebuild from nearly a decade of bombing.
Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate being here in Full Frame.
Today, Sera is the CEO of Legacies of War, an advocacy organization that educates the public about the continued consequences of the American wars in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. This episode is called The Secret War in Laos.
Full Frame.
I want to talk about your father's legacy, but I also want to talk about the Secret War. But and the reason why I want to talk about the Secret War is because I don't think a lot of people know about the Secret War. So it was a pretty good secret in that sense, because it's not a story that's widely shared even today. But let's start with your dad.
Mm-hmm. So my father definitely had a profound impact on my life. His name is Dr. Sera Koulabdara. And unfortunately, in 2017, we lost him after a long and hard battle with cancer. So he was in a hospital in Dallas, Texas during that time. And I was fortunate enough to be able to spend the last 2 months of his life with him. And during that time, my dad had to take a whole bunch of pills, and it made him super drowsy. And he knew that he didn't have a lot of time. So he asked me to keep him awake because he wanted to spend every precious moment with my siblings and I. So I didn't really know what to do other than ask him to tell me stories about his childhood. And most of it was really fun stories. He's the eldest of 9. And at the age of 12, he was sent to school from the southern part of Laos, where my family's from, to Vientiane province. He got an academic scholarship to go to Lycée de Vientiane. And that's where he spent such happy memories, whole bunch of friends. He was popular, handsome young man. He loved playing soccer. His idol was Pele. And he wanted to be, a soccer star. But in 1964, when the first American bombs were dropped, his life completely changed. My father witnessed bombs raining down, villagers, people in his neighborhood, people that he knew, the lady who sold lunch to him, the temple where he stayed, destroyed, and chaos all over. And he had to flee to try to figure out what was happening to his family. So just witnessing all the pain, destruction, and devastation happening in his beloved Laos just changed the trajectory of his life. No longer did he want to become the next Pele, but he was inspired to try to heal, just trying to mend the pain and suffering by becoming a doctor. So he wanted to figure out what he can do to help, knowing that from the age of 14, Mike, all the way to 23, my dad essentially grew up in war, growing up in this environment that no child should have to grow up in. But instead of allowing that to just make him like allowing it to like defeat him, he decided that I want to do something that's positive in order to figure out how I can be a part of the solution. So he studied hard, he watched doctors that were helping different soldiers just heal people, even the monks, he learns things from them, how to use different things in the environment in order to make that medicine. So this wasn't like going to a medical school and residency, but this was learning on the job, Mike. So, in a way, I think back on just how my dad was able to grow up in this environment of war, pain, destruction, loss, but how resilient he is in transforming it and making it into something that he can take part in and help be the solution of has really inspired me, to be in my role today with Legacies of War.
My brother was drafted, ended up in Vietnam. So, and I'm old enough as a kid remembering watching the news coverage. But the news coverage, here's Walter Cronkite. They'd have a reporter or two in the Mekong Delta or somewhere in Vietnam telling that part of the story. This part of the war story was not really reported on that much at all.
Yeah. To kind of give, you talked a little bit about, the history of the American Secret War in Laos and how this is still very much a part of U.S. history that is hidden. Is because it's not in American textbook. If it is even mentioned, it's like a small footnote, like Laos. And most people are not even aware of that, let alone like the greater U.S. wars that happened in Vietnam and Cambodia. So, in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. dropped at least 13 million tons of ordnance in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In Laos alone, the U.S. dropped at least 2.5 million tons of ordnance during 580,000 bombing mission. So that's equivalent to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 long years. It earned Laos, per capita as the most bombed country in the history of the earth. And one of the staggering statistics of this war is that 98% of the casualty during those bombing are civilians.
Talk to us about the fact that you mentioned this in one of the stories, so a little kid, you're told you better walk this specific way because there's lions and tigers or whatever. It wasn't because there's bombs out there and you could just trip on something and boom. But that's the reality, right?
That's absolutely the reality. So, I grew up in southern Laos, and growing up, the presence of UXO, unexploded ordnance, I knew it exists. My grandmother would ask us to take us to the temple, asked my siblings and I to pray for my parents' safe return while they were out working, because my dad, being a doctor, he worked on countless victims of UXO accidents. And my mother, renowned seamstress, I'm actually wearing her sin, she would mend clothing for children who have lost a limb. So I knew that it exists, but as a child, because my parents, of course, did their best to keep us safe, we felt pretty safe, until my dad took a job at one of the top hospitals in Vientiane, Mahosot. And we moved there. And this was during the time that my siblings and I started going to school. And while my parents tried to shield us by making up stories about tigers and the pea or the ghosts that would come get us if we veer off this path, it was simply because they knew that there are unexploded ordnance laying around. And the majority of these ordnance, while there's hundreds of different kinds, the main one that are littering Laos are cluster munitions. So the design of cluster munitions in particular are designed to look like toys. They look like a ball, like the bocce ball that children typically play with. Sometimes they're colorful, like the pineapple one. Some of them have ribbons on it. So most of the time, children are so attracted to them. And, imagine 6-year-old me being so curious. I would pick it up and play with it. One of the most vivid memories I have growing up is of one of my classmates, La, who, one day they were screaming and banging on our doors. Villagers were asking for my father to come out. And I followed him, and what I saw was just La laying there with her mother just crying out in pain and anguish, begging for my father to save her life. In order to save La's life, my dad was forced to amputate her leg. He was still wearing his lab coat during that time, and it was soaked in blood. Everything was red during that time. And this accident, Mike, happened in 1989, decades after the end of the war. And La was only a 5-year-old little girl. So when you look at it, the majority of the bombs that were dropped, up to 30% of them failed to detonate on impact, which means that we estimate at least 80 million of these cluster munitions are still littering 1/3 of Laos. And they'll be there until they're triggered by a small child or an animal, or unless we clean them up first. And that is, the hopeful part of this is that we know we have a solution for it. We just need the funding and the dedication, the political will to continue to get the job done.
Obviously, funding's always an issue. Just kind of give me an idea of what are we looking at in terms of really tackling this problem in a serious way?
Yeah. It's an uphill battle, but I have great hope because there are people who truly, truly care about getting this job done and making this a priority, right? So, first, this is a problem that exists in Laos, and numerous other countries are impacted by war. But specifically, with the Lao PDR's leadership, the government, one of the things that I think it's so important is that the government is prioritizing this, right? This is Laos's number one priority in terms of challenges that they're trying to tackle for their citizens. There's sustainable development goals, 17 adopted by a global community. Laos added an 18th sustainable development goal called Lives Saved from UXO. So that's a pretty huge, bold step for a country to say that this is a top priority, which means that they're expanding the NRA, or National Regulatory Authority, right? The overarching body that really prioritizes demining and working with organizations that do the clearance work, right? Like the National Team UXO Lao, MAG, HALO, international nonprofits, Norwegian People's Aid, making sure that the methodology to do clearance work is shared, making sure that these teams have all that they require in order to continue their work, right? In addition to that, amplifying the message, keeping this at the forefront of international partners. The Lao PDR, early this year, hosted an event focused on this issue along with Azerbaijan at the United Nations, and this is one where they include nonprofit organizations like ourselves to really come and speak on the issue and continue to, be each other's sounding board. What else are we learning? Who else can we ask to support this? So that's one. The second piece is, I'm very proud of the United States government in prioritizing this issue as well.
This is something that cuts both Democrats and Republicans support it. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so it's the UXO and Demining Caucus, and this is on the House side. The caucus is focused on really prioritizing this issue and being supportive of humanitarian demining, which means, funding it as well, on a consistent basis. And, my team and I, along with so many of our partners, help recruit members to this. We're always telling members of Congress about this and the importance of having support on both sides, right? Because this is not a political issue. This is a humanitarian issue. Demining really supports just changing the reality of a lot of people in impacted country. There's a difference between a child being able to go to school safely or a farmer being able to farm their land for food. It's just something so simple. There's a difference between someone getting a prosthetic for a limb that they lost. or just getting travel to a hospital, right? And it goes beyond that in the preventive nature of the funds that are able to be allocated to support explosive ordnance risk education programs in various schools and villages of people who, are born decades later. Without this being a priority of the American public, without members of Congress hearing from their constituent that this is a priority, we don't know if the next cycle will receive funding or at what level.
Can we close by talking about the emotional weight of what you do? I mean, the story you told, the gentleman telling that sad story about how his family, his life impacted your father's story. Just the emotional weight and just how that drives you. And yet, you haven't made it to the finish line. And I'm sure that weighs on you. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, the journey ahead is really long. It's a big mountain to climb. But, I'm reminded and motivated by the fact that the view at the top is going to be a safer Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam for millions of people, and in particular, children. There's a quote, by a famous author who's one of my favorites, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who says, all wars are fought twice, first on the battlefield and the second in memory. I add to that by saying that, there's a third, which is in reconciliation and reconstruction, right? And there's a long way for us to go. It's been 50 years. Less than 10% of the contamination left behind in Laos has been cleared. All 63 provinces in Vietnam are still impacted. At least 15% of Cambodian territory are still contaminated by munitions. But we can't let that stop us because we know that there are people who care and leaders who have that political will in order to make change happen. As long as we can continue to tell this story, be invited to Full Frame to talk about it and other different platforms that help us amplify this message, I think is something that moves me. But I also like to bring it back to just the people that I meet year after year. I'm heading to Laos and Vietnam next month. And these are living, breathing human beings, people who have families, children who have mothers that love them, farmers, grandmother who's just trying to cook meal for their family. Just remind that they're not just stats, that I'm writing in my report, but they're human beings that deserve just a basic human right to live free from the dangers of these old war trash.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
That was my conversation with Sera Koulabdara, CEO of Legacies at War. And that's all for this Full Frame podcast. Our thanks to my colleagues Jolie Lee and Jan Surjanen here in our CGTN studios. And if you want to watch the full-length Full Frame show, please go to CGTN Now on Apple TV. From all of us at Full Frame, I'm Mike Walter. Thanks so much for listening.